Chapter 12 of Against the Grain. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Against the Grain by Joris, Karl, Huysmans. Translated by John Howard. Chapter 12, Part 1. During the days following his return, Des Esseintes contemplated his books and experienced, at the thought that he might have been separated from them for a long period, a satisfaction as complete as that which comes after a protracted absence. Under the touch of this sentiment, these objects possessed a renewed novelty to his mind, and he perceived in them beauties forgotten since the time he had purchased them. Everything there, books, bric-a-brac, and furniture, had an individual charm for him. His bed seemed the softer by comparison with the hard bed he would have occupied in London. The silent, discreet ministrations of his servants charmed him, exhausted as he was at the thought of the loud loquacity of hotel attendants. The methodical organization of his life made him feel that it was especially to be envied since the possibility of travelling had become imminent. He steeped himself in this bath of habitude, to which artificial regrets insinuated a tonic quality. But his books chiefly preoccupied him. He examined them, rearranged them on the shelves, anxious to learn if the hot weather and the rains had damaged the bindings and injured the rare paper. He began by moving all his Latin books. Then he arranged in a new order the special works of Archelaus, Albert le Grand, Lully, and Arnaud de Villanova, treating of the Kabbalah and the occult sciences. Finally, he examined his modern books, one by one, and was happy to perceive that all had remained intact. This collection had cost him a considerable sum of money. He would not suffer in his library the books he loved to resemble other similar volumes printed on cotton paper with the watermarks of Auvergne. Formerly in Paris, he had ordered made, for himself alone, certain volumes which specially engaged mechanics printed from hand presses. Sometimes he applied to Perrin of Lyons, whose graceful, clear type was suitable for archaic reprints of old books. At other times, he dispatched orders to England or to America for the execution of modern literature and the works of the present century. Still again, he applied to a house in Lille, which for centuries had possessed a complete set of Gothic characters. He also would send requisitions to the old Enschede printing house of Haarlem, whose foundry still has the stamps and dies of certain antique letters. He had followed the same method in selecting his papers. Finally growing weary of the snowy Chinese and the nacreous and gilded Japanese papers, the white Whatmans, the brown Hollands, the buff-coloured Turkeys and Seychelles mills, and equally disgusted with all mechanically manufactured sheets, he had ordered special laid paper in the mould from the old plants of Vire, which still employ the pestles once in use to grind hemp. To introduce a certain variety into his collection, he had repeatedly brought from London prepared stuffs, paper interwoven with hairs, and as a mark of his disdain for bibliophiles, he had a Lubeck merchant prepare for him an improved candle paper of bottle blue tint, clear and somewhat brittle, in the pulp of which the straw was replaced by golden spangles resembling those which dot Danzig brandy. Under these circumstances, he had succeeded in procuring unique books, adopting obsolete formats which he had bound by Lortic, by Trotz Bosonnet or Chambolle, by the successors of Capet, in irreproachable covers of old silk, stamped cowhide, Cape goatskin, in full bindings with compartments and in mosaic designs, protected by tabby or moire watered silk, ecclesiastically ornamented with clasps and corners, and sometimes even enamelled by Gruel Engelmann with silver oxide and clear enamels. Thus, with the marvelous episcopal lettering used in the old house of Leclerc, he had Baudelaire's works printed in a large format recalling that of ancient missals, on a very light and spongy Japan paper, soft as elder pith and imperceptibly tinted with a light rose hue through its milky white. This edition, limited to one copy, printed with a velvety black Chinese ink, had been covered outside and then recovered within with a wonderful genuine sow skin, chosen among 1,000, the color of flesh, its surface spotted where the hairs had been, and adorned with black silk stamped in cold iron in miraculous designs by a great artist. That day, Des Esseintes took this incomparable book from his shelves and handled it devotedly, once more reading certain pieces which seemed to him, in this simple but inestimable frame, more than ordinarily penetrating. His admiration for this writer was unqualified. According to him, until Baudelaire's advent in literature, writers had limited themselves to exploring the surfaces of the soul, or to penetrating into the accessible and illuminated caverns, restoring here and there the layers of capital sins, studying their veins, their growths, and noting, like Balzac, for example, the layers of strata in the soul possessed by the monomania of a passion, by ambition, by avarice, by paternal stupidity, or by senile love. What had been treated heretofore was the abundant health of virtues and of vices, the tranquil functioning of commonplace brains, and the practical reality of contemporary ideas, without any ideal of sickly depravation or of any beyond. In short, the discoveries of those analysts had stopped at the speculations of good or evil classified by the Church. It was the simple investigation, the conventional examination of a botanist minutely observing the anticipated development of normal efflorescence abounding in the natural earth. Baudelaire had gone farther. He had descended to the very bowels of the inexhaustible mine, had involved his mind in abandoned and unfamiliar levels, and come to those districts of the soul where monstrous vegetations of thought extend their branches. There, near those confines, the haunt of aberrations and of sickness, of the mystic lockjaw, the warm fever of lust, and the typhoids and vomits of crime, he had found, brooding under the gloomy clock of ennui, the terrifying spectre of the age of sentiments and ideas. He had revealed the morbid psychology of the mind which has attained the October of its sensations, recounted the symptoms of souls summoned by grief and licensed by spleen, and shown the increasing decay of impressions while the enthusiasms and beliefs of youth are enfeebled, and the only thing remaining is the arid memory of miseries born, intolerances endured, and affronts suffered by intelligences oppressed by a ridiculous destiny. He had pursued all the phases of that lamentable autumn, studying the human creature, quick to exasperation, ingenious in deceiving himself, compelling his thoughts to cheat each other so as to suffer the more keenly, and frustrating in advance all possible joy by his faculty of analysis and observation. Then, in this vexed sensibility of the soul, in this ferocity of reflection that repels the restless ardor of devotions and the well-meaning outrages of charity, he gradually saw arising the horror of those senile passions, those ripe loves, where one person yields while the other is still suspicious, where lassitude denies such couples the filial caresses whose apparent youthfulness seems new, and the maternal candours whose gentleness and comfort impart, in a sense, the engaging remorse of a vague incest. In magnificent pages he exposed his hybrid loves, who were exasperated by the impotence in which they were overwhelmed, the hazardous deceits of narcotics and poisons invoked to aid in calming suffering and conquering ennui. At an epoch when literature attributed unhappiness of life almost exclusively to the mischances of unrequited love, or to the jealousies that attend adulterous love, he disregarded such puerile maladies and probed into those wounds which are more fatal, more keen and deep, which arise from satiety, disillusion and scorn in ruined souls whom the present tortures, the past fills with loathing, and the future frightens and menaces with despair. And the more Des Esseintes read Baudelaire, the more he felt the ineffable charm of this writer, who, in an age when verse served only to portray the external semblance of beings and things, had succeeded in expressing the inexpressible in a muscular and brawny language, who, more than any other writer, possessed a marvelous power to define with a strange robustness of expression the most fugitive and tentative morbidities of exhausted minds and sad souls. After Baudelaire's works, the number of French books given place in his shelves was strictly limited. He was completely indifferent to those works which it is fashionable to praise. The broad laugh of Rabelais and the deep comedy of Moliere did not succeed in diverting him, and the antipathy he felt against these farces was so great that he did not hesitate to liken them, in the point of art, to the capers of circus clowns. As for old poetry, he read hardly anything except Villon, whose melancholy ballads touched him, and here and there certain fragments from d'Aubigne, which stimulated his blood with the incredible vehemence of their apostrophes and curses. In prose, he cared little for Voltaire and Rousseau, and was unmoved even by Diderot, whose so greatly praised salon he found strangely saturated with moralizing twaddle and futility. In his hatred towards all this balderdash, he limited himself almost exclusively to the reading of Christian eloquence, to the books of Bourdaloue and Bossuet, whose sonorously embellished periods were imposing, but still more he relished suggestive ideas condensed into severe and strong phrases, such as those created by Nicole in his reflections, and especially Pascal, whose austere pessimism and attrition deeply touched him. Apart from such books as these, French literature began in his library with the 19th century. This section was divided into two groups, one of which included the ordinary secular literature, and the other the Catholic literature, a special but little known literature published by large publishing houses and circulated to the four corners of the earth. He had had the hardihood to explore such crypts as these, just as in the secular art he had discovered under an enormous mass of insipid writings a few books written by true masters. The distinctive character of this literature was the constant immutability of its ideas and language. Just as the Church perpetuated the primitive form of holy objects, so she has preserved the relics of her dogmas, piously retaining, as the frame that encloses them, the oratorical language of the celebrated century. As one of the Church's own writers, Ozanam, has put it, the Christian style needed only to make use of the dialect employed by Bourdaloue and by Bossuet, to the exclusion of all else. In spite of this statement, the Church, more indulgent, closed its eyes to certain expressions, certain turns of style borrowed from the secular language of the same century, and the Catholic idiom had slightly purified itself of its heavy and massive phrases, especially cleaning itself, in Bossuet, of its prolixity and the painful rallying of its pronouns. But here ended the concessions, and others would doubtless have been purposeless, for the prose sufficed without this ballast for the limited range of subjects to which the Church confined itself. Incapable of grappling with contemporary life, of rendering the most simple aspects of things and persons visible and palpable, unqualified to explain the complicated wiles of intellects indifferent to the benefits of salvation, this language was nevertheless excellent when it treated of abstract subjects. It proved valuable in the argument of controversy, in the demonstration of a theory, in the obscurity of a commentary, and more than any other style, had the necessary authority to affirm, without any discussion, the intent of a doctrine. Unfortunately, here, as everywhere, the sanctuary had been invaded by a numerous army of pedants, who smirched by their ignorance and lack of talent the Church's noble and austere attire. Further to profane it, devout women had interfered, and stupid sacristans and foolish salons had acclaimed as works of genius the wretched prattle of such women. Among such works, Des Esseintes had had the curiosity to read those of Madame Swetchine, the Russian, whose house in Paris was the rendezvous of the most fervent Catholics. Her writings had filled him with insufferably horrible boredom. They were more than merely wretched. They were wretched in every way, resembling the echoes of a tiny chapel where the solemn worshippers mumble their prayers, asking news of one another in low voices, while they repeat with a deeply mysterious air the common gossip of politics, weather forecasts, and the state of the weather. But there was even worse. A female laureate, licensed by the Institute, Madame Augustus Craven, author of Récit d'une Sœur, of Eliane, and Fléorange, puffed into reputation by the whole apostolic press. Never, no, never had Des Esseintes imagined that any person could write such ridiculous nonsense. In the point of conception, these books were so absurd, and were written in such a disgusting style, that by these tokens they became almost remarkable and rare. It was not at all among the works of women that Des Esseintes, whose soul was completely jaded, and whose nature was not inclined to sentimentality, could come upon a literary retreat suited to his taste. Yet he strove, with a diligence that no impatience could overcome, to enjoy the works of a certain girl of genius, the blue-stocking pucelle of the group, but his efforts miscarried. He did not take to the Journal and the Lettres, in which Eugénie de Guérin celebrates without discretion the amazing talent of a brother who rhymed with such cleverness and grace that one must go to the works of De Jouy and Écouchard Lebrun to find anything so novel and daring. He had also unavailingly attempted to comprehend the delights of those works in which one may find such things as these: "This morning I hung upon papa's bed a cross which a little girl had given him yesterday," or "Mimi and I are invited by Monsieur Roquier to attend the consecration of a bell tomorrow. This does not displease me at all," or wherein we find such important events as these: "On my neck I have hung a medal of the Holy Virgin which Louise had brought me as an amulet against cholera," or poetry of this sort: "Oh, the lovely moonbeam which fell on the Bible I was reading," and finally such fine and penetrating observations as these: "When I see a man pass before a crucifix, lift his hat and make the sign of the cross, I say to myself, 'There goes a Christian.'" And she continued in this fashion, without pause, until after Maurice de Guérin had died, after which his sister bewailed him in other pages, written in a watery prose strewn here and there with bits of poems, whose humiliating poverty ended by moving Des Esseintes to pity. It was hardly worth mentioning, but the Catholic party was not at all particular in the choice of its proteges, and not at all artistic. Without exception, all these writers wrote in the pallid white prose of pensioners of a monastery, in a flowing movement of phrase which no astringent could counterbalance. So Des Esseintes, horror-stricken at such insipidities, entirely forsook this literature. But neither did he find atonement for his disappointments among the modern masters of the clergy. These latter were one-sided divines or impeccably correct controversialists, but the Christian language in their orations and books had ended by becoming impersonal and congealing into a rhetoric whose every movement and pause was anticipated, in a sequence of periods constructed after a single model. And in fact, Des Esseintes discovered that all the ecclesiastics wrote in the same manner, with a little more or a little less abandon or emphasis, and there was seldom any variations between the bodiless patterns traded by Dupanloup or Landriot, La Bouillerie or Gaume, by Don Guéranger or Ratisbonne, by Freppel or Perrault, by Ravignan or Gratry, by Olivin or Dosité, by Didon or Chocarne. Des Esseintes had often pondered upon this matter. A really authentic talent, A supremely profound originality, a well-anchored conviction, he thought, was needed to animate this formal style, which was too frail to support any thought that was unforeseen, or any thesis that was audacious. Yet despite all this, there were several writers whose burning eloquence fused and shaped this language, notably Lacordaire, who was one of the few really great writers the Church had produced for many years. Immured, like his colleagues, in the narrow circle of orthodox speculations, likewise obliged to dissipate his energies in the exclusive consideration of those theories which had been expressed and consecrated by the fathers of the Church and developed by the masters of the pulpit, he succeeded in imbuing them with novelty and in rejuvenating, almost in modifying them, by clothing them in a more personal and stimulating form. Here and there, in his Conférences de Notre Dame, were treasures of expression, audacious usages of words, accents of love, rapid movements, cries of joy, and distracted effusions. Then, to his position as a brilliant and gentle monk whose ingenuity and labors had been exhausted in the impossible task of conciliating the liberal doctrines of society with the authoritarian dogmas of the Church, he added a temperament of fierce love and suave diplomatic tenderness. In his letters to young men may be found the caressing inflections of a father exhorting his sons with smiling reprimands, the well-meaning advice and the indulgent forgiveness. Some of these Des Esseintes found charming, confessing as they did the monk's yearning for affection, while others were even imposing when they sought to sustain courage and dissipate doubts by the inimitable certainties of faith. In fine, this sentiment of paternity, which gave his pen a delicately feminine quality, lent to his prose a characteristically individual accent, discernible among all the clerical literature. After Lacordaire, ecclesiastics and monks possessing any individuality were extremely rare. At the very most, a few pages of his pupil, the Abbe Peyrève, merited reading. He left sympathetic biographies of his master, wrote a few lovable letters, composed treatises in the sonorous language of formal discourse, and delivered panegyrics in which the declamatory tone was too broadly stressed. Certainly the Abbe Peyrève had neither the emotion nor the ardor of Lacordaire. He was too much of a priest and too little a man. Yet here and there in the rhetoric of his sermons flashed interesting effects of large and solid phrasing, or touches of nobility that were almost venerable. But to find writers of prose whose works justify close study, one was obliged to seek those who had not submitted to ordination, to the secular writers whom the interests of Catholicism engaged and devoted to its cause. End of chapter 12, part 1. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.